Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Charlotte Gallagher, and today we're joined by our religion editor, Aleem Maqbool. And Aleem, we're continuing to see strong reaction from across the world about President Trump's comments about Pope Leo.
Yes, so we're seeing reaction on a couple of things. On that tirade, first on social media and then in person. He gave an interview on camera. He said he wasn't a fan of Pope Leo. He took credit for Pope Leo being elected at all, saying if it wasn't for him, then Pope Leo wouldn't have been elected. And it came from a place of responding really to what he saw as criticism from Pope Leo over recent weeks about the war in Iran. And then later in the day also posted this image, an AI-generated image that a lot of people presumed was him trying to depict himself as a Messiah, as Jesus.
President Trump said, "I was depicting myself as a doctor."
I was interested, though, that he thought enough about the backlash that he did ultimately remove the post and felt like he needed to make that justification because, during conclave last year, he posted an AI-generated image of him as the Pope, and that's still up there. What he didn't do is what a lot of Catholics were calling for, which is apologize to Pope Leo for the social media post and his verbal attack on Pope Leo. He hasn't done that, even though there are some allies of his who are Catholics who've called for him to do that.
Particularly strong comments from Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, as well. This is what she said. "I express my solidarity with Pope Leo after Trump's comments. I won't feel comfortable living in a society where religious leaders do what political leaders tell them to do."
Yeah, so when we talk about Catholics who have traditionally stood alongside Donald Trump, Giorgia Meloni was one of those in the past. She has found other reasons to be critical of Donald Trump in recent months, but one of the world leaders who has come out very strongly in opposition to the not necessarily just the post and the attack on Pope Leo, but she had also raised issues about whether the war in Iran was just or not with President Trump.
Has he crossed a red line then with Catholic voters in the US, do you think?
It's really interesting. Certainly the last 24 hours or so has crystallized feeling that was already growing. Criticism from Catholic leaders is not unusual for President Trump, particularly on issues like immigration and the US treatment of migrants it's planning to deport. He's received lots of condemnation in the past from the Pope, not directly. The Pope has talked about policies rather than the man himself. But the Catholic community in the US is notoriously quite split politically. Yes, you can look at it along race lines. Latino Catholics, Hispanic Catholics tend to lean Democrat, and white Catholics tend to lean Republican. And certainly that's how it was in the 2024 election. But there is big division on big issues, on abortion, on immigration. There are big divides between left and right. What has been really interesting to me is speaking to people on the right, conservative Catholics who had very much, sometimes being at odds with the Catholic leadership in the US, which is quite left-leaning. They had been very supportive of President Trump. Certainly, they feel that a line has been crossed in the way in which President Trump attacked Pope Leo, and also with this AI post being generated. But actually, it's crystallized feeling over the last 4 or 5 weeks, where there has been a sense among a lot of American Catholics that they don't feel that the war in Iran was just. And Pope Leo there is a part of this because he's been very clear in one direction. When, for example, President Trump talked about a civilization dying in Iran.
Over Easter.
Pope Leo was very, very clear, calling it truly unacceptable. And I spoke to a very prominent conservative Catholic commentator, Peter Wolfgang. He's one of those Catholics who's sort of a pragmatist. He didn't like President Trump to begin with in sort of 2016, but he looked at it in a pragmatic way because he's someone who wanted abortion laws to be overturned. But he's since become a very enthusiastic supporter of President Trump. He has criticised even Catholic hierarchy in the US over its opposition to President Trump's immigration policies, which he supports. And what Peter Wolfgang said to me is President Trump doesn't understand how Catholicism works. The Pope isn't merely a head of state, he's the vicar of Christ. Attacks on him are received as attacks on the church itself, and the more he attacks the Pope, the more his support will drop among his Catholic voters. So that is somebody who thinks this is going to have a long-term impact.
So it could potentially have an impact, I suppose, if this continues on the midterms, if he continues to pick these fights.
Potentially. Like I say, when it comes to US Catholics on the right, they still agree with President Trump on a lot of his policies. They still don't really have an option, an alternative, really, if you are opposed to abortion, if you agree with those sort of mass deportations or the immigration policies of the US administration. There's nowhere else really for them to turn. So it could be that we see people staying away from the polls in the midterm elections. But it's really difficult to say where this goes long term, but certainly in the short term, his standing has been damaged among American Catholics. As one Catholic bishop said to me, a conservative Catholic bishop, Joseph Strickland, who's a bishop in Texas, was very pro-Trump. I mean, he gave speeches at a rally in 2020 to say that the election had been stolen from Donald Trump. He last year took part in a prayer ceremony where Mar-a-Lago was consecrated, for example. So a strong ally of Donald Trump. He was so offended by what's happened in the last 24 hours. And also the way that President Trump has sort of ploughed ahead with his war. He said two things. He said, this is where US Catholics need to realize, I think he might have been talking about himself a little bit as well, that actually they shouldn't be following a national leader. They should follow God and follow Christ and follow the Pope's teachings. But he also said that the last 24 hours meant that he felt a duty to remind President Trump that in the Bible, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says that all power on earth and in heaven belongs to him. So a reminder that he's got the power. It's supreme power. It's not in the hands of any man.
Thanks, Aleem. That was the BBC's religion editor, Aleem Maqbool. And if you would like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, please click the link below. Thanks for watching.